Okay, hello everyone. We're just going to get everyone in from the waiting room. So thank you for being patient with us. And as we get everyone in, I'm just going to get started with our introduction. So hello and welcome to episode 3. I'm Lindsay Randall, the host of this speaker series. And Digging In is a series of live presentations with scholars from around the country, co-sponsored by the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And so we are going to begin today with the land acknowledgement for the land that the Peabody Institute and its school, Phillips Academy, are on. So Phillips Academy occupies the land of the Pennacook and Patuxet people and the lands of the contemporary Abenaki, Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, Pokanoket, and Nipmuc nations. And we honor all Indigenous people who are here now, have been here for time immemorial, and will be here in the future. And we acknowledge Indigenous genocide and the continued oppression of Native peoples, voices, cultures, and spiritualities. And we understand how education has been used by settler institutions in the attempted erasure of Indigenous peoples. And we commit to interrogating the histories of and our complicity in colonization, centering Native voices and communities, and dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism at Phillips Academy and beyond. So join us every other Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through December for our presentations. For a schedule of dates and presenters, please visit us at peabody.andover.edu or at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society's Facebook page. And if you enjoy our programming, consider expanding your impact by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. We are able to bring you outstanding programming through the support of viewers like you. And today we are excited to welcome Kat Warren and Paul Martin. Paul Martin is an archaeologist who integrates HRD dog teams and with geophysical surveying tools. He has deployed HRD dogs since 1998 and has worked on forensic cases and at historic and pre-contact burial sites across the country, in Europe, and in the Philippines. He has consulted or worked on cases for numerous law enforcement and government agencies at the local, state, and national levels. And Paul has founded an HRD canine training organization and has taught HRD handlers and trainers across the country. And he has presented his research and collaborated with national forensic science organizations, archaeological organizations, geological, and tribal groups, among many others. Kat Warren is a science journalist and professor emerita at North Carolina State University. She has trained, researched, and written about scent detection dogs since 2004. And she works closely with Paul Martin on burial ground site projects in the Southeast. Her best-selling book on scent detection dogs, What the Dog Knows, Scent Science and the Amazing Ways Dogs Perceive the World, was longlisted on a PENEO Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And she's a former magazine editor and newspaper reporter and has won numerous journalism awards. And she has lectured and published about the potential and promise of incorporating well-trained HRD dogs and handler teams into archaeological work. So during and at the conclusion of the talk, viewers are able to submit questions directly to me via the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And at the end, we will give our speakers time to answer as many questions as they can, with the understanding that we might not get to all of them. So welcome, Kat and Paul, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I just wanted to thank you, Lindsay, and Suanna Selby Crowley and the Massachusetts Archaeological Society and the Peabody Institute for hosting this. We're really excited to start this discussion about something that we think is promising, but is a kind of demanding compilation of a lot of different disciplines and skills. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let us see if, are we good there? Great.
Yes.
Okay. So what Paul and I are going to do is I'm going to take some slides. Paul will take some slides. We'll probably interrupt each other occasionally. We're going to try to wrap it up at 45 minutes so that we can get to questions. Paul, I'm afraid, can only stay for an hour because he needs to be on the road to Florida for another job. So one of the things that it makes this work so, I think, challenging is because it is this combination of so many different skill sets. So I'm going to spend just maybe 10 minutes kind of going through just a quick overview for people on the call who may not be familiar with what we call human remains detection dogs or canines, or cadaver dogs. The FBI at one point tried to use the term victim recovery canine. I don't think that has totally caught on, but I think that you get the idea. Yeah, with HRD dog or cadaver dog. Please note that the picture of this burial chest is, these are remains from Iron Age, and we'll be talking about this particular site in Croatia. So just to note that. So human remains detection dogs are simply dogs that find the odor of decomposing human remains. And one of the challenges is that human decomposition is really complicated. So is animal decomposition, of course, but part of the challenges that we face are what can the dog find if it's well trained and the conditions are right, and what are they alerting on or recognizing as the smell of human decomposition, or in forensic cases, human blood. And you can see this list. It's somewhat complete when we think about what happens to bodies, and with the realization that with any human remains detection dog, that dog has to be trained on the spectrum of these things, right? To be able to recognize these things. Dogs sometimes can generalize and do, but the ideal, and we'll, as we start to talk about dogs in archaeology and much older remains, the ideal is that these dogs are trained on actual human remains and on the variety of things they're going to find out in the environment or buried. More and more research is being done on what the dogs are recognizing and what creates human decomposition. So the volatile organic compounds that come off a body or bone, there are so many of them depending on the situation, the circumstances. More than 480 different volatile organic compounds have been identified. Actually, not all of those are volatile, but you can see that it's a complex set of odors. So what we know and the degree to which we can kind of take some of the work that's been out there over the last decades and transfer it over to archaeology is that human remains detection dogs have been deployed in the United States and across the world for a number of years. The formal work became sort of a thing in the early 70s in the United States. The person you see in that photograph, Andy Redman, is kind of considered the father of this field in the United States. He's working here on a case that involves skeletal remains of victims of a serial killer. And what we do, and Paul and I will talk about this, is that these cases end up telling us things about the effectiveness in archaeology or not. So, so these are all the reasons that you would take an HRD canine out into the field. Dogs are really, really good at narrowing areas, covering areas, getting into areas that humans might have a hard time getting into. I think of this all the time in the South with our dense underbrush. And then there are all these other disasters and increasingly climate-related disasters, but collapsed buildings, et cetera, where dogs, once again, are super effective. And the reason I'm sort of showing this slide, and maybe some of you remember this terrible mudslide in Oslo, Washington, that basically the side of a hill came down the mountain into a small town, covered the town, backed up the river. It was a square mile of mud. And one of the reasons when we say some of this work can tell us about the work in archaeology is that the mud was so deep, and the dogs were able to help enormously. I talked and interviewed many of the people who were on this site who had dogs, but also some of the rescue workers who said they would have had no idea where to start. I will note that when we're looking about 43 victims, this was an enormously damaging disaster. So we are not necessarily talking about intact bodies in this case. Nonetheless, the dogs helped the workers know where to start to dig. The other thing is to know is that when we're talking about detection dogs, where scent is available isn't necessarily exactly where the person is located. So it's something to keep in mind when we talk about the kind of historic burials we're dealing with in archaeology. Another increasing disaster, which are wildfires. This is Mary Cable and her Malinois Inca. The campfire in the little town of Paradise was sort of one of the first terrible fires that ripped through California. And one of the reasons we're noting this, and Paul's going to talk briefly about that's sort of a secondary use of the dogs, is that these were intense fires. People were really reduced to ashes. The availability of scent and lots of VOCs coming off those remains, it's a really narrow range. And Paul, do you want to talk briefly about the secondary?
Yes. First off, I want to say thank y'all to our host for having us. But with the campfire in 2018, and then subsequent wildfires that have swept through these areas, and specifically these residential areas of California and Oregon, one of the things that they've done is brought in the dogs after they've cleaned out or removed the victims, those that were actually killed and perished in the fire. And because a lot of times when they're evacuating these residential areas, it's really get out now and take what's on your back and leave. And a lot of times, because we are seeing an increased number of people and families choose cremation for their loved ones, we are seeing those urns with their loved ones being left behind. And so they're using the dogs to actually go back through and sweep through the area with the dogs, specifically looking for those urns that have these remains that have already been commercially cremated and now have been heated and charred again through the process of the wildfire. And that's going to even further reduce any type of volatiles, VOCs, that are going to be available to the dog to be able to say, here, this is human remains or human decomposition odor. So that's how, we're seeing the dogs be used that way with reduced odor.
That's, and so, all of these things start to teach us a little bit more about what the dogs are capable of, with the understanding that we still don't know what exactly it is that the dogs are finding significant in terms of these organic compounds to alert. But the fact is that well-trained dogs do it. And as time goes on, we're hoping to get closer to knowing exactly what some of those compounds are. So this is where we start getting into historic or ancient remains, pre-contact remains, or Iron Age, Bronze Age, over in Europe and other countries. This is Dixie. Lisa Higgins has an enormous amount of experience in historic burials, along with clandestine burials and cold cases. And you can see that Dixie is an alerting on an older grave, and which is unremarkable. It's like dogs can certainly learn, like, oh, here's a headstone, I'm going to alert. Dixie is not doing that because of how she's been trained. But you'll see in this is the same cemetery in Ohio, and you can see that slight depression, and odor is clearly coming out of that depression, and Dixie is letting Lisa know with her alert or her trained final indication. So the only thing to note on this slide is to say that it's incredibly important that dogs that are going to do this work have a great deal of experience in areas like this, where we either know that the burial is there or nearby, or there's been enough work with GPR and other methods that you can have a real clear idea of what the dogs are capable of. Paul, you were going to say something here.
Yes. One of the things we also have to take into account is that with the success or the ability for the dogs to have success on locating some of these historic burials, some of that is relegated to have the remains been embalmed, what type of coffining material has been used. Additionally, you've got to remember that a lot of times we think of burials as being 6 foot deep because that's all we were taught as we were growing up. But when we're looking at these historic burials, they're really not 6 foot deep, because how are we digging them? We're digging them by hand. And even though it might be an Ames shovel, it's not the same quality of the Ames shovel that you run down the street and buy today. Okay. So we've got all of those factors that go into that, and that impact the odor availability to the dog, along with the environmental conditions. And we'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah, and just to note, what's interesting when you watch dogs training on a cemetery where you have more recent burials, the dogs are not interested in the more recent burials. That scent is not as available to them. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what we know in terms of peer-reviewed literature. And I want to put a big asterisk at the beginning of this to say that one of the things that's difficult about HRD canine research is that there hasn't been a lot of it. There is an slowly increasing amount of it. There's a number of reasons for that. Could delve into a few of them, but one of them is simply that access to well-trained working dogs to do this kind of research can be really difficult. There has tended to be, as Paul pointed out, that certain funding agencies actually didn't want to fund canine studies. And yet what we're getting more and more studies with good controls and with the realization that out in the field, there are so many factors that have to be controlled for that, again, we're looking at a handful. And I will note, if you look at these, that in one of the cases, the German study on cadaver dogs with carpet squares, those dogs were alerting on carpet squares that had no direct deposit of either fluid or anything except the scent of decomposition. And the dogs did an excellent job. Or in the case of teeth, we're talking about very, very faint scent. And yet teeth can be enormously important. So just these sort of things to think about when we look at the peer-reviewed areas. We already talked a little bit about human decomposition odor and what we're dealing with, and the fact that there's so much overlap between animal decomposition and human decomposition. There's even certain kinds of cheeses that have the same kind of odor of decomposing animals that that humans have. So we're looking at a thing where it is an area that's important for a couple of reasons. This research aids the ability to find what are known as pseudoscents, but training aids that can be developed for easy access. And there are many countries that where they don't allow human remains to be used for training dogs. In the UK, even though it's not illegal for to train on human remains, they are still standardly training on pig remains in the UK. So all of these sort of become an interesting sort of arena for us to think about. It is really important, and especially if we think about these burials, that HRD dogs differentiate between animal remains and human remains, and well-trained ones do. So I'm going to let Paul take this slide.
Yes. So when we start looking at the ability of the dogs to locate buried human remains, there's absolutely just minuscule published research out there. One of the early papers out there was by a grad student, Elena Lassiter, at University of Alabama, and she was looking at capabilities here in the Southeast, and she was taking dry bone and burying it, and then seeing if the dogs could locate that. Well, we also have to take into account the disturbance of the soil and things like that, the construction of how these problems are set up. But it helps us begin understanding, the soil conditions, and how the odor itself begins reacting and passing through. Some of the work that Kat has already shared, one of the things that the research showed with that was that with the more recent burials, it was taking up to 14 to 17 days for compounds to show up in high enough concentrations that they were, detectable by the instrumentation. Whereas we don't have that narrow window to be operating in with the historic era and pre-contact era. This has had oftentimes a century, or in some cases centuries, for those odors, for those VOCs to migrate to the surface. And at the same point in time, we've got research that's being done by Dr. Ben Alexander that's really beginning to look at the soil solutions and helping us understand how long some of these compounds are staying viable in the soil, okay? That and how those compounds are truly moving in the terrain. So we are actually beginning to get a much larger body of scientific research that helps further support some of the things that we've already seen with the dogs and that handlers have seen and discussed for the last 30 plus years. So, Kat?
Yep. So, Paul, so this is where we sort of add a new method, put another method on top of the dogs.
Yeah, yes. One of the things that, especially in working with historic sites, one of the things that we've got to be able to do is see what's kind of there beneath the surface. And ground penetrating radar has helped us immensely with that since it first started being drug out to be used by archaeologists in the 70s, and then being refined and really getting some definition and some really great parameters around how it can be deployed in the 80s and 90s till we get some of these early seminal works in the early 2000s with Conyers and so forth. But now what's taking on is that technology has really been the same, okay? But what's really been enhanced over the last 20 years is how we process that signal that's getting returned back to the instrument. But we also have other things such as the gradiometry or magnetics, and then resistivity. And being able to use all of these in concert together help us stack the different data sets, and then we add the dogs with that to start giving us a better understanding of what that blob, what that wave signal actually is that's there in the data. So
good. So I think that one of the things that I want to quickly mention, because we haven't said anything about it, is this GPR plus dogs plus other systems. That dogs are a great tool for helping narrow an area to search. In other words, to help somebody looking in an area where you're not sure where there might be a burial ground, that the dogs will be a sort of time and expense saving method to help narrow that area so that you can concentrate on the most promising areas, right? So one of the things I want to sort of note as we leave the peer-reviewed literature is the degree to which so much of our knowledge comes from law enforcement cases, human rights cases, mass graves. We'll talk more about Andrea Pintar and her work soon, but Andrea's specialty has been, along with her husband, Chris Nikolic, is to look for mass execution sites across Eastern Europe. So this is just to give you a little overview that as we think about what it is we know in terms of applying this to archaeology, much of what we know comes from law enforcement cases. And as Paul and I were talking about this is inevitably a somewhat not open source area of knowledge, right? We can't openly share across across different cases and states, and it would be very helpful if we could, but that's not how it works. And so in a way, we have these huge knowledge databases that remain, in a sense, not fully accessible, except that nonetheless, right, cold cases and cold case burials and clandestine graves are how people started to think about doing this work in historical human remains. So, so the future. Paul will have something to say about this. I want to say something quickly before we look at a couple of the pieces of peer-reviewed work that are great that have been done. This is an area that is so ripe for both really good work and also not so good work. The fact is that the number and amount of sort of knowledge, bodies of knowledge for HRD canine handlers and their dogs to have access to, it's huge. And one of the things that's needed is that this work needs to be scaled up, and it needs to have standards and sort of all those things that we think about for a promising but still somewhat young field. So, so those are some of the caveats. Paul, do you have something? I mean, we're going to talk about standards later. Do you have something to add to that?
You know, one of the things is I think some of the journals are beginning to change their approach also, because I know in the past I've been able to get poster sessions and paper sessions at different professional meetings, but the different journals and speaking with the editors have, said, no, we're not interested in that type of paper at this time. And it wasn't a knock on the quality of the paper. It was just, we're not interested in that work at this point in time. But we are in a state of change right now. And so we are beginning to see more journals beginning to open their publishing to saying, okay, we will review it. We will publish that.
Yeah, so we've got just about another 15 minutes before I want to open it up to questions. So let's talk about a couple. This is Vedrana Glavish and Andrea Pintar's peer-reviewed study, and we'll be happy to provide that bibliography. But this is an Acropolis in Croatia. It's where the burial chest that I showed as the second slide is located. These are reconstructed beehive burial sites with those little stone coffins. And the dogs in a double-blind study were able to locate 4 heretofore unlocated burial coffins, realized that these are reconstructed. The dogs were simply working on rubble. And this is what the dogs were working on to alert. So this study raises 2 questions. One of them is, what is it that has remained in this stone that continues to exude the scent of human remains? And indeed it does. Very often there weren't even very many bone fragments, but There was what some handlers and trainers are calling a decomposition odor island, right? If you think about what happens to the human body when it essentially melts down into rock. So Ade Shun, I love this quote from her. She has enormous experience in training dogs and figuring out how to do this. Once again, the problem is that every case is different, right? Every burial ground is different. As she said, you can't just replicate it easily. And the dogs can do it, but the challenge remains that these are very old burials. I will say that Andrea was kind of freaked out by the ability of their dogs to do this. She came in as a skeptic, and she was already working on cases back to World War II, and she left going, oh my God, 2,700 years old. So
yes, we spent a number of conversations, reassuring her that yes, they can do this.
They can.
One of the things I wanted to mention, I believe it was Dr. Aikenhead Peterson or Peters there at Texas A&M that coined the term decomposition island. And that's basically just all that soft tissue, as it liquefies, it is absorbed into the soil and will create this unique soil and chemical change right there. And that's part of what the dogs are picking up on. And because it is detectable for, obviously centuries later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the screen
Paul,
here,
we've got about 10 more minutes tops.
Yep. On the screen here, you see Derry Sharp, one of my field techs, collecting some GPR data there in Florida. But with that, you also see a listing of some of the equipment that we commonly use in our work on different projects, from gradiometry to drone imagery to even infrared photography and so forth. So we can go ahead.
Okay.
This
is you, Paul.
Yeah. Here, one of the things that dogs can help provide us is being able to survey in conditions that, if we were going to survey all of that with ground penetrating radar or even gradiometry, we're going to have to come in there and really clean the site up a lot more. And so we can, go through and get an understanding of where we need to search. But we need to also, if we are an archaeological firm employing these practices, make sure that we're using dog and handler teams separately, that they're not working in concert with each other. That way, the data that you get back isn't being influenced from one handler to another handler. We have to take into consideration that temperature, time of day, humidity, even the soil type are all factors that can negatively impact the working ability of the dog. Specifically, we tend to look at the day as having two principal working periods, especially in the summer. We have an early working period and a late working period. With our early working period, that could be sunup, 5 as early as 5:30, some places, and that's starting in the field at that time, and working till 9, 10 o'clock. You know, working, starting back later in the afternoon, late in the day, making sure we're providing that hydration and rest, not only for our dog, but for the handlers. Okay. With the work, you want to make sure that you're getting tracks off of the handler and off of the canine as well. Dogs' trained final responses should be flagged. When they're flagged, they should be, or they should immediately be recorded. I prefer to record those with sub-meter GPS or higher accuracy. And then the handlers, along with the archaeologists that are supervising them, really should understand the subtle signs that you see in the burial grounds with just the slight things, such as that post you see there. Obviously, it is a post. It lies outside of the protected area where they put up a beautiful 10-foot tall chain link fence to protect the cemetery, but it lies about 15 foot outside of the cemetery, and that they've protected. And we partnered the dog's work along with noticing these differences with the GPR, and you can see they are in the field without any additional processing, that we've got a nice little row of burials popping out there in the data. Okay. Most of the time when I'm collecting GPR data, I'm not looking at that data in the field. I'm more interested in collecting it, getting it back to the laptop so I can process it and then come back out.
Okay, so our time has flown, and so I'm going to go through a couple slides pretty quickly. I will say that we are seeing more and more work being done in the Southeast on locating African-American burial grounds. More funding for that is coming through. The need is great. These places are being destroyed daily. I mean, I know that many of you are already aware of that. I just pulled up a few things. NPS is working on a project in the Appalachian Smoky Mountain National Park. In the work in the West, on the Western United States, it goes along a similar path. Here are some projects that involve Chinese immigrant cemeteries, sort of the trail cemeteries. There's a great deal of work being done now working with tribes. There's increasing interest, of course, with boarding schools and locating burial grounds at boarding schools where Native American children were removed from their families. So, and that work is happening in Canada as well. So one of the things that we need to talk about with all of this is training, and I want us to have time to do that, but we're almost at 2:15. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these slides super quickly so that we can get to sort of what should you be looking for? Should you be interested in working with teams that use dogs? So this is an example, the Tallahassee, this is a country club in Tallahassee, Florida. I love this National Park Service pic of the ground penetrating radar in the foreground and Shiraz, human remains detection dog, alerting in the background. None of this work would have happened, and as this is so often the case, without activists and descendants really working, pressing, making sure that this happens. The final photo there, screenshot, is of dog alerts plus ground penetrating radar and an estimated number of how many burials were on this golf course at the Capital City Country Club. This kind of work has become very visible, and there was a lot of coverage about the country club. Paul and I and Derry Sharp have started working at Shockoe Hill African Burying Ground in Richmond, Virginia. It is, you can see it on the right, that's a city-owned parcel of 1.2 acres where you see that abandoned mechanics station. On the left is a Hebrew cemetery. Up the hill is Shockoe Hill Cemetery for Whites. The African burying ground is so desecrated by the highway, by Highway 64. There's railroads down there. Literally, when they repaved when they resurfaced this street that you see the car on in the 1880s, they were digging up so many skeletal remains that there's documents showing that they decided to use them as roadbed. So it's an absolutely sort of horrific case. Now, thanks to one descendant, Lenora McQueen, who has worked on this and researched it. This is now part of a historic district that has just been recognized this past June. I'm going to note really quickly, because I do want to leave time for questions, just all the knowledge base that goes into this. And we'll sort of say this again and again, is this, that the dogs are a somewhat visible but small part of the overall work that gets done. The fact is that Lenora McQueen, working with Ryan Smith, who is an amazing historian at Virginia Commonwealth, which is just next to this burial ground. This is some of his work sort of showing all the changes. The city of Richmond has a planner who has done a ton of work on this. You can see her down there as they're looking at ground penetrating radar on that 1.2 acres. You can see how this is challenging work for the dogs, but it's equally challenging to try to figure out all the ways that this area was desecrated and where scent might be available or where there might be intact burials. So Paul, I'll let you say a little bit about this.
With this slide, what we're actually seeing here is really in the top right corner, a overview of the work that was done by the canines and the different operational periods that they were deployed in the field. So we get an understanding of how much was actually covered by a dog's nose. From there, we also, as part of that historical research, we do dig into those older maps and things like that to get an understanding. So when we're laying things together, we can really kind of see what has been disturbed, what has not been disturbed. And then on the left-hand side, we're seeing two different traces and of GPR data. And one of the things that we have been told routinely was that all this site had been destroyed. Even other firms had come through and basically written the site off, that there'd been too much destruction, as you could see in the earlier slide, one of the earlier slides, where the crown of the hill had been removed. But we've got potential burials. The signatures are actually fairly intact they're in the data for burials there that are not disturbed. But we do have evidence to suggest that we've got several instances where the site has been disturbed. The upper layer, we can see where on one part of the site, the shaft for a lot of the graves have been removed, but the bottom portion of the grave seems to be there. So it took quite a bit of time to actually decipher the data and to understand what it was I was looking at. Okay. Part of that, though, is helped by the use of the dogs saying, wait a minute, something is here in this area, to slow down and double check. So
yeah. So to wrap this up, and I think if anybody wants to contact us, we're going to have contact information on the last slide. It'll also be in the recording, and we will be happy to send you sort of HRD canine standards. This is just a quickie about what you might be looking for. There is no existing standard right now for historic human remains detection, but what our assumption is that people who are learning how to do this will have national or state standards for human remains detection sort of across the board. And then on top of that, the training in historic burials and old remains detection, there are opportunities out there for people to get that kind of training. It is not an entirely different discipline for the dog, but the dogs need to learn how to slow down and be methodical. Dogs have all sorts of purposes in terms of trying to find the missing. And in this case, burials can be a real challenge. So this is just a little bit of a laundry list. I want to make sure we've got some, I see that we have some questions. Let me note, this is Kathleen Connor with her wonderful dog Seamus. She's an example of a handler who has a really good operational HRD dog, and she is now sort of learning burials, right? And that's what's needed. Cadaver Dog Handbook, I noted that. There's also a really excellent new book out, which is hugely expensive because it's an academic tome. Canines, the Original Biosensors, just came out in the last year, just chock full of great information. Our contact information, Martin Archaeology, catwarren.com, the easiest, and there are our emails. But I'm going to stop the share, and I will drop our contact info into the Q&A. So that's it.
Well, thank you. That was excellent. So yeah, so I'm gonna relay some of the questions. We have a lot of questions, so I know we won't get to all of them, but like you said, you're gonna give your contact information, so anyone can reach out or re-watch this. This will be posted to the YouTube channels for both the Peabody Institute and the Mass Archaeology. So our first question is, are specific breeds focused on for this work, or are handlers open to any dog breed to complete this task?
Probably not a King Charles Cavalier Spaniel, but maybe there are some that are actually great at nose work. So I joke a little bit. The fact is that in the United States, we're seeing a lot of Labrador retrievers, golden retrievers, along with the German Shepherd, Malinois, sort of the troika. But I know a lot of different breeds, border collies, right? So it's too long of a it's a huge field of dogs capable of doing this work. That said, not every dog within that breed category is going to be successful at this work, because there are things you need to have the dog be able to do. And I will say that one of my pet peeves is to see posts on Facebook where there's a 7-week-old puppy and everybody's saying, this is my search and rescue dog of the future. And it's like, a lot of dogs actually drop out. This is hard work, and they have good noses, but much needs to be done.
You always see the ones that are like, they failed out of police academy and are now like a hospital greeter or something, right? Those little puppies.
Yeah, and that's a good job. So
yeah, everyone needs it.
Why don't we do this, Lindsay? If there are specific questions for Paul, since I know that he needs to get on the road, I'm happy to stay further. People may want to drop out, but I'm happy to stay on as long as needed. Are there
I don't know if this one would be for Paul, that they knew that humidity and temperature affects the dog's ability to scent detect, but they didn't realize about soil type affecting the search. Can you speak to how different soil types and how they make a search easier or harder?
Yeah. So soil types, specifically with soil types, one of the things we're looking at is the particle size of the different soils. And when we look at the different particle sizes, specifically we're looking at clay a lot of times, and the more moisture that clay's been exposed to, the particles will actually swell. And as they swell, it chokes off the ability for odor to escape from the ground. When that actually dries out, you have more availability of odor escaping. One of the things that makes sand sometimes hard to work in is depending on the depth of reaching the hard pan underneath the sand could be quite a bit of depth there. And so what happens is if it gets any type of rain, moisture, things like that, things tend to wash down and flow down away from the remains versus actually flowing up. And so long term, that makes it really difficult.
Okay. We have another question for Paul. Do you know of a state standard for using archaeological geophysics to identify NRHP eligible sites? From Al.
Okay, so looking at the different states for the state historic preservation offices and so forth, one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of is a lot of boilerplate language where they have truly just copied and pasted from one state to the next. I do know, like, the state of Virginia is in the process of hoping to revise that and really beef theirs up so that it is actually something more substantial than just the standard, geophysics should be applied in these type of situations and recorded this way. So that's pretty much what it is.
The last question we'll ask, and then we'll wrap this up, because I know other people, not just Paul, need to go. Is there a push to create a group or association to create standards across the board that works with, but isn't necessarily under the umbrella of police groups?
I'm going to answer this. This is an ongoing sit down and think about it. really important question to ask. And thank you, Melissa, for asking that question. And hello. Paul and I have been seeking funding that would include looking at and establishing best practices for using dogs in archaeology. Right now, a group does not exist. And I would say that this is a problem, across the arena of HRD dog teams, right? Is that there are so many different standards. Some of them are not as rigorous as others. We are in the midst of having that discussion, and it is to be continued. Can I answer, Tad, quickly about soil chemistry? Soil chemistry is a really interesting question, Tad, and I wish that we had the labs and funding to be able to collect soil samples and see if there is the sort of chemical signature of human decomposition in those soils. It's been done in a couple of cases, but it is expensive and very few specialists do this. Paul, am I correct in my overall?
That is correct. And I was going to say exactly the same thing, that there's actually limited research towards that with very limited practitioners. You do have a couple of grad students that have done it as well and published on it. But I don't, for the most part, I don't believe any of them have been able to continue on in a lab setting where they have the capabilities to continue on. And that's a major factor. We can do a lot of the stuff a lot of times when we're affiliated with a university. One of the things I wanted to go back and kind of plug something else on looking at a broader overview of an organization. One of the things that we are trying to do this year at the SAA meeting in Portland is have a session specifically on canine resources for archaeologists with papers from a number of different handlers and archaeologists that have been involved with this type of work from across the country and not just a limited scope. So that's going to be very important.
I mean, part of us, what we want to do finally, and I know that we need to wrap up, is that being able to scale up in a sustainable and still maintaining quality kind of way is definitely sort of on the table when we think about, what are the next steps here. So
excellent. Thank you to both of you and for doing this. This was incredibly interesting and very important for the field of archaeology. And thank you to our viewers for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next lecture, which will be Wednesday, September 14th, when we are joined by Anya Gruber, who will be speaking about ecological change in coastal Massachusetts from about 1400 to 1700. And again, we rely on the support of viewers like you, so consider supporting our outreach by becoming a member of the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And once again, this will be posted to YouTube, and Kat and Paul's contact information was on one of the last slides and is in the chat. And
I will just say a couple people noted about a bibliography, and if they email me, I'm happy to shoot a selected bibliography out to them with some of these sources. So thank you.
Thank you.